My name is Jen Krim, and I'm originally from Kentucky, but have lived in Washington, D.C. for years. I also lived in the Arabian Gulf and have worked in the U.S. government and am now in Tunisia and traveling writing a book about the Arab Spring. Before I came here, I had actually studied the Middle East and North Africa for a long time because when I was younger, this was the most foreign place I could think of. But the first time I came, I was surprised not by how foreign it was, but actually by how familiar it was. I'm from a place called Kentucky in what I consider to be the American South, and it's very socially conservative and very Christian. In my town, there was actually no alcohol until just a few years ago. There's a focus on saving yourself until marriage, very hospitable and generous, and a small town atmosphere. And in the Gulf, I felt it was very similar. It was the same way. People were open and generous and focused on family values, and it was socially conservative and friendly. One thing I did not expect to find in the Middle East, North Africa, were the very interesting stereotypes about Americans, especially about American women. And some of the more extreme examples that I've heard, I met a Qatari woman who, when we became friends, she started asking me these burning questions she had about American women. She asked if there were American women over age, I think she said 13, if they were virgins. If there were any virgins over the age of 13, if every American woman had to have a paternity test to figure out who the father of her child was, if every American woman slept with each of her male friends. And a lot of these stereotypes came from American media. She had seen shows like Jerry Springer, talk shows like Jerry Springer. She had seen American movies, a popular plot line where women fall in love with their friends and get married. And another stereotype that I was surprised at was that the U.S. was very dangerous. I met a young a young Kuwaiti teenager who wanted to study in the U.S., but her parents wouldn't let her because they'd seen so many American movies that were violent, and they believed when she came to the U.S. she'd be raped, killed by gang violence, killed by a serial killer, and they wouldn't let her come to the U.S. There are actually two things I expected to find, which I was very happy that they were true. One was the food, which I love, from Khaliji biryani to Tunisian couscous and harissa mshwiya. But in all seriousness, I expected to find people who were the same as in the US, kind and generous and open and very willing to talk about where they're from and what they believe, and to share. People who understand that there's a big divide between the US and this part of the world and are eager to kind of set the record straight. Well, I think there are a lot of stereotypes about this region that are really unfortunate. One of the most disturbing stereotypes is that this region is very dangerous. In fact, a lot of my friends and family said their final goodbyes to me when I move here, because they believe that as a blonde American I'll be targeted and killed by terrorists. And they haven't seen the Middle East that I see, which is full of generous and kind people. They believe that, especially because of 9/11, they think that the region is very violent, and they don't see the kind and generous people. They don't see the culture, the religion as being peaceful. I think there are a lot of stereotypes about that, and there are also funny stereotypes. I think people have actually asked me if, as a woman, I can drive a car, and they ask me if I ride camels while I'm here. I think that there are a lot of negative stereotypes perpetuated by the American media. I think that the American media shares a lot of stories that are inflammatory about this region, stories that come from Saudi Arabia, that come from Iran, that come from Afghanistan. Iran and Afghanistan are not actually Arab, obviously. But I think many American women get the feeling, and what they see in the media is that Arab women are forced to cover, that they're not allowed to drive, that many are oppressed, that they are not educated, or they're not allowed to participate in society. And I think the stereotype, number one, is very, very, very wrong and very unfortunate. I think Arab women are often portrayed as victims, when in fact the women that I've met in the various different countries I've been to are some of the bravest, strongest people I've ever met, and they fight constantly. But also the question of hijab, I think, is very interesting. A lot of Americans ask me if, when I come to this region, I have to cover my hair, if I have to cover my body, and if I have to cover my face. And I think many Americans get the view from the media that the images in Yemen are the same as the images in Tunisia. But they may not realize that in Tunisia, there are some Tunisian women who are also Arab and Muslim who wear miniskirts and stilettos. I think there's a difference in culture between the different countries that doesn't come across in the media, and that a lot of Americans don't understand. And hijab is also very interesting because many Americans forget that some Christians cover their hair. And in recent history, my mother, for example, grew up in the Catholic Church, and she was raised to cover her hair whenever she went into church. And it's something that I think a lot of Americans forget. And I think that it's very important to not take American culture and lay it on top of the culture in the Middle East, North Africa, but to try and see the culture through the eyes of the people who actually live here, and to see that the cultures in each country are different. So in the US, I'm sure many American women would say that their culture, they would not feel comfortable going to the post office in a bikini. And some women in Yemen, for example, would feel more comfortable wearing a different dress than people in Tunisia, than people in the US, than people in France. I think that the American media doesn't do it on purpose, but I do believe that yes, the message that many Americans receive is that the Middle East, North Africa is how the media portrays Saudi Arabia, how the media portrays Yemen or Afghanistan. I don't think the media does a very good job of sharing the differences between each country, that a woman in Afghanistan who wears burqa, in Tunisia, the women sometimes wear miniskirts and stilettos, and I don't think that the differences between the different countries actually comes through. And I think that's a real shame. And maybe not out of ignorance, but I think the stories that the US media shares with Americans, they're stories that Americans would find interesting or fascinating or surprising. And I think that the stories that are inflammatory are stories that people remember, and I think that's part of it. But I also think that people in the US don't understand this region, and I think that people tend to fear what they don't understand. And I think also that that's another reason why in the US media, TV, movies, news, people in this region are often portrayed as villains. They're not portrayed as how they should be, as they actually are. And I think that's a shame. I believe that new media can make a big difference. I think that new media helped unite people across class lines, across sectarian lines, through the Arab Spring. And I think that that newfound solidarity can also be used to connect people across the cultural divide, to connect people from the Middle East, North Africa, to people in the US. Because I think right now the current system isn't working. The current system of statistics and dense news articles and NGOs and government programs, I think it's not working. I think that the human brain is wired to put more emphasis on emotion than reason. Humans like to think of themselves as reasonable creatures, but honestly, the human brain, when you're making a decision, it puts more weight on emotion than reason. So statistics can only go so far. I think that the way people have to connect is emotionally and through a personal connection, and I think that the news media, the dense news articles, the think tanks, academics, and government programs, it's not helping bridge the cultural gap. And that's actually why I'm here. I'm doing a book about the Arab Spring, and what I'm trying to do is help people in the US connect to women here who went through the revolutions, and to make a personal, emotional connection, so that a woman in Kansas who lost her son in the Iraq War can connect to a Syrian woman who lost her son in the current conflict, so that a rural woman in Alabama can connect to a rural woman in Yemen and see that, there are a lot of things that unite us. There are more things that unite us than divide us. So I have one superficial example of how things in the U.S. are actually very similar to experiences in the Gulf that I have. I remember a lot of get-togethers and barbecues in the U.S. where people are standing around talking about politics and sports and religion, and they're drinking tea and lemonade and talking about their families and catching up with each other. And the Bible will usually come out and people talk about religion. And in the Gulf, it was the same way. The differences were that the lemonade had mint in it, the tea was hot, not iced, and instead of a pig on a spit, there was a lamb. But I also want to point out that a lot of the religious figures that people talked about at the barbecues are the same. That Muslims believe in Jesus, Isa. They believe in Mary, Maryam. They believe in
My name is Becky Hurwitz, and I live in New York. I live in Brooklyn. With most of my time, I work in technology, and I work at the sort of intersection of social justice and tech, which is working with activists to help them figure out how to use technology to make their work more efficient or more effective. I think it's very easy for for us as people to assume all sorts of things about other people's motives and lives, and I think that there's just a lack of exposure to different kinds of people, and the ease with which we're able to and willing to accept stories that we're told about other people is um, is part of the problem. I think if you live your life in New York and you never leave New York, then you're apt to believe the little things that you hear about people living in other places, whether it's the middle of this country or whether it's some other country, right? If all you have is a few limited media channels and they're all saying similar things, you just never have a chance to like break out of that. I do think though that the Arab Spring was helpful in at least giving new. I mean, maybe again it's just stereotypes, but at least giving new archetypes, maybe is a better term for this, to Americans about who people from the Middle East might be and what they might want, and you can have an image of you can have a belief about what somebody else is or what they're motivated by, and that could color everything that you understand about why they're acting, right? So I'm sure that you could have a stereotype of an American or of somebody from the Middle East and say, oh look, but this person totally fits this model. Like here's this American and they walk in and they're egotistical and they're super loud and like they don't understand any other languages, and I don't know what else you might say. And then it's easy to convince yourself that all of the other things that you believe about Americans are also true. So I think when we assume that we understand somebody, we're all making mistakes. I think people with the higher ground are people who realize that they can't assume these things and they ought to meet people and actually know them. And I think also, I think these stereotypes are also made by our governments, right? Like people who are really invested in ideology and in proving that one ideology is correct and another is not are the same people who are creating these stereotypes and telling us that because somebody acts a certain way, that means it's wrong. So, so I don't know about on like the large scale, but I think we talked about this a little bit. So when I was in Cairo in when I was in Cairo in March. One of the things that was really exciting to me was that everybody was agitating for change, right? And so students in universities were agitating to get the board members to turn over, and new professors and cab drivers were rallying in Tahrir and for higher wages, and like just everybody was agitating for little bits of change. And I think that if we looked at that micro level, that we would find that we have extreme amounts in common, like that all those little changes are what we all want.